February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. For the first time in World War II, large American ground forces faced experienced German troops in a full-scale battle. What followed was a shock, not only for the U.S. Army but for its commanders in Washington and London. Units of the U.S. Second Corps, led by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, were spread thin, poorly coordinated, and commanded from miles behind the front. German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim exploited every weakness. American positions collapsed. Tanks were destroyed. Communications failed. Within days, over 6,500 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. To German officers observing the battle, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Americans were inexperienced, slow learners, and unprepared for modern warfare. Some German reports even dismissed U.S. troops as technically strong but tactically naive. But what the Wehrmacht did not understand, and what would later terrify them, was how the American system reacted to failure. Unlike Germany, the United States did not hide defeat behind ideology or propaganda. The loss at Kasserine triggered an immediate and brutal internal review. Within weeks, General Dwight D. Eisenhower removed Fredendall from command. He replaced him with Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a commander known not for ideology but for discipline, speed, and ruthless efficiency. Patton arrived in North Africa in March 1943 and changed everything. He reorganized command structures, enforced strict battlefield discipline, and demanded constant coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Officers who failed were replaced. Tactics that didn't work were discarded without hesitation. Most importantly, the U.S. Army began to treat combat as a learning process. After-action reports were written after every engagement. Mistakes were openly discussed, analyzed, and corrected. Lessons learned in Tunisia were transmitted across the entire U.S. Army, from North Africa to training camps in the United States. This was something the German military system struggled to do. By 1943, many German commanders were trapped inside rigid doctrines and political expectations. Decisions were often influenced by ideology rather than battlefield reality. Orders from Hitler increasingly overruled frontline commanders, even when conditions clearly demanded change. In contrast, the American command structure allowed adaptation. Junior officers were encouraged to report failures honestly. Tactical manuals were updated in real time. Coordination between ground forces and air power, especially with the U.S. Army Air Forces, was rapidly improved. German intelligence officers soon noticed a disturbing pattern. American units that had performed poorly only weeks earlier began fighting differently. They moved faster. They coordinated artillery and airstrikes more effectively. They adjusted formations after contact instead of repeating the same mistakes. By late 1943, German commanders on the Western Front were no longer facing the same enemy they had seen at Kasserine. They were facing an army that learned, and learned fast. And this ability to absorb defeat, analyze it without excuses, and return stronger would soon become one of the most dangerous weapons the United States brought to Europe. Because for the Wehrmacht, the war was no longer just about firepower or numbers. It was about an enemy that adapted faster than they could react. And this lesson would become painfully clear as American forces prepared for the largest invasion in history. July 10, 1943. Sicily, Operation Husky. What German commanders encountered in Sicily was not the same American army they had defeated months earlier in Tunisia. The U.S. 7th Army, now under General George S. Patton, landed alongside British forces on the southern coast of the island. The invasion was chaotic, imperfect, and costly, but it revealed something new. American units adjusted while fighting. When airborne drops scattered paratroopers miles from their objectives, junior officers reorganized ad hoc units and continued advancing. When tank columns met unexpected resistance, artillery and air support were coordinated faster than before. Communication errors were documented and corrected within days, not months. German General Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin later noted that American forces showed an unusual willingness to change tactics mid-campaign, something rarely seen earlier in the war. This adaptability became even more evident during the push across Sicily. Patton replaced ineffective officers without hesitation. Battalion commanders were rotated. Operational lessons were sent directly to Allied headquarters and integrated into future planning. By August 1943, Sicily had fallen. But the real alarm for German intelligence did not come from the loss of the island. It came from the speed at which the Americans had improved. Only weeks later, the same U.S. divisions that struggled during the landings were conducting coordinated advances with artillery, armor, and air power acting as a single system. The pattern repeated itself in Italy. During the landings at Salerno in September 1943, German forces initially inflicted heavy casualties. Yet once again, American command adapted. Naval gunfire was integrated more effectively. Air-ground coordination improved. Defensive lines were reinforced based on battlefield feedback. German officers began reporting that American units no longer attacked blindly. They probed. They withdrew when necessary. They returned with adjusted tactics. This was deeply unsettling. The Wehrmacht had been trained for wars of movement and decisive blows, not prolonged contests against an opponent that learned faster with every engagement. By early 1944, German commanders along the Atlantic Wall prepared for the inevitable Allied invasion of France. Many still believed American soldiers lacked the experience for sustained combat in Europe. But internal German assessments told a different story. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, who had fought Americans in North Africa, later admitted that U.S. forces demonstrated remarkable improvement in leadership, coordination, and operational flexibility within a very short time. What worried German planners most was not American courage or equipment. It was the system behind them. Training manuals were rewritten based on frontline reports. New units arrived in Europe already trained on lessons learned in Africa and Italy. Commanders had the authority to adjust plans without waiting for ideological approval. Meanwhile, German command structures were becoming increasingly rigid. Hitler personally interfered in operational decisions. Retreats were forbidden. Failures were blamed on individuals rather than systems. The contrast could not have been sharper. As American forces prepared for Operation Overlord, they were no longer learning how to fight the Germans. They were learning how to beat them. And when the landings in Normandy finally came, the Wehrmacht would face an opponent that adapted faster than German doctrine could respond. An army that did not repeat mistakes, but absorbed them. And this difference would soon decide the fate of Western Europe. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Operation Overlord. When American forces came ashore on the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command expected chaos, and at first they were right. At Omaha Beach, U.S. infantry units were pinned down. Landing craft were destroyed. Officers were killed within minutes. Communications broke down almost immediately. But what followed shocked German observers. Instead of waiting for new orders, small American units adapted on the spot. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers reorganized shattered platoons. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Naval gunfire was redirected based on frontline requests. By the end of the day, the beachhead held. This was not improvisation by chance. It was the result of a system that encouraged initiative, learning, and decentralized decision-making. In the weeks following D-Day, American forces encountered fierce German resistance in the Norman bocage. Hedgerows neutralized tanks. German infantry used terrain expertly. Casualties mounted, and once again, the Americans adapted. Special hedgerow cutters were welded onto Sherman tanks in the field. Infantry tactics were revised. Air-ground coordination improved. Artillery was integrated more precisely with advancing units. German General Gunther Blumentritt later admitted that American forces adjusted tactics faster than expected, even under heavy losses. By July 1944, U.S. units were no longer stalled. They were breaking through. Operation Cobra demonstrated the full effect of American adaptability. Massive air bombardments were coordinated with ground advances. Commanders modified plans in response to real-time battlefield conditions. German defensive lines collapsed. For the Wehrmacht, the realization was grim. The Americans did not repeat failure. They studied it. By late 1944, this pattern became undeniable during the Battle of the Bulge. When German forces launched their last major offensive in December 1944, they initially achieved surprise. American units were pushed back. Supply lines were strained. Weather grounded Allied aircraft. Yet even under these conditions, the U.S. Army adapted faster than German planners anticipated. Units held key road junctions. Commanders redeployed forces flexibly. Once weather cleared, air power was reintegrated with devastating effect. German advances slowed, then stopped. After the war, German generals openly acknowledged the problem. Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote that American forces were exceptionally quick to learn from experience, and that their command system allowed mistakes to be corrected rather than concealed. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was trapped. Orders flowed downward without feedback. Failures were blamed on disobedience. Strategic decisions were increasingly dictated by ideology. While Germany clung to rigid solutions, the United States refined its methods. The result was not just victory, it was dominance. By 1945, American units arriving in Europe were better trained than those that had landed in North Africa just 2 years earlier. Lessons from every defeat had been absorbed, standardized, and transmitted across the entire army. For German commanders, this was deeply unsettling. They were not fighting an enemy that relied on genius or blind aggression. They were fighting an enemy that learned faster than war itself could punish mistakes. And in modern warfare, that ability, more than tanks, more than aircraft, became decisive. Because in World War II, adaptability was not just a strength, it was a weapon.